do you have a general rule of thumb for how much equity a 9% tax credit deal will create versus a 4% tax credit? People understand
60%.
60% for 9% tax credits.
Yes, about 60%. And
How about
the
for 4%?
4% creates about a 4% equity because your rents are higher in a tax credit, a tax exempt bond program. You'll have more 60 and 80% AMI rents with a small 10% of 30%.
For a 4% deal. That's what you're talking
Or a
about.
4% deal. You'll have 60s down to 30s, and you'll have the full spread.
And the reason why 9% is more advantageous because it creates more equity, but then in order to score the points to earn those 9% tax credits, that's why you're saying the rents are typically set aside for people making 30% of the area median income and 60%. So it's a different type of demographic, right?
Exactly.
And 4% tax credits, does that generally equate to like 20 to 30% of the equity stack?
It could be as much as 40.
It can be as much as 40. Okay, got it. Well, maybe this is a good time to talk about the bonds that you were talking about, right? Because I don't think a lot of people understand. Sometimes I just like to tell people that bonds is just debt, but
that's all
you have to issue the debt through either a 501c3 nonprofit or a government entity that's issuing those bonds. But have you ever seen a project done completely with tax exempt bonds before?
Oh yeah, many. And lately that's a majority of.
And what's the advantage of going through tax exempt bonds? Why do people pursue a 9% tax credit versus the tax exempt bonds?
The 9% was prevalent for a long time because it brought in all the equity you needed and you really didn't have to go after the subsidies as much. Now it's to the point where the program is so oversubscribed that unless you're the top of the top of the top, you're not going to get it. And that's a lot of money you invest to get to that point, to get turned down. Could have anywhere from 50 to 250,000 in a project easily. The 9% really you cap at a certain amount because the sweet spot in the 9% program is 80 units.
Okay, welcome back to another episode of Affordable Housing and Real Estate Investing. Today, we got Al Barshow returning onto the podcast. I just recorded one of my first sessions with him yesterday, and I had a blast. And when he told me he had a couple more hours for me, I jumped on that right away because I knew the value that he would provide for all of our listeners today. So, Al, welcome back to the show. How's it going today, man?
Thanks, Ken. Yesterday was a lot of fun. Really enjoyed it.
Well, I have a lot of fun talking with you, and you just share so many different stories and so many different ideas and perspectives on why one regulation works and how do people approach financing. I mean, you came up with some really creative strategies yesterday, and I thought maybe today we can start by just diving in a little bit and really get into the meat of it and talk about how do people actually get deals funded? Because you talked about LIHTC. I understand there's traditional construction loans. I understand there's HUD loans, which are new construction loans that are insured by HUD. Now, what type of financing have you seen throughout your career that's been used for affordable housing and ground-up development? Let's just start with a couple of financing mechanisms that you have done yourself and talk to us about the pros and cons of each.
Well, the number one that we started with when the program was still pretty young was the 9% tax credit program. And with that, we'd just get a conventional loan. So our bank would just lend a typical construction loan, but they loved affordable housing because the equity was the majority of the cost of the building. So bank loans were easy to get and they were well priced. And then they'd get their CRA credits as well as maybe kicking in some benefits here and there for the project. Then as the demand grew and people were producing a lot of this, the 9% was very hard to get. So we shifted to starting to use bonds, which you're very familiar with. And with the bonds, of course, you need more subsidy and et cetera. And then you have to raise all this subsidy. But with the bond, it was attractive because the bond was a better rate in the big picture that unless you were going to do a market rate and conventionally finance it, the bond was cheaper. Now, it cost you about $200,000 and $250,000 up front in just attorney's fees and bond fees and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, the city had to issue allowance for the bond that they'd allow you to do it. So there was a whole lot of issues with it, but the financing was good and still is. It's just that now the bond rate wasn't as good in the last 5 years as conventional interest rates. So even though people were still using the bonds, they weren't as advantageous. but you'd still do it because you were working in the tax credit program. And the 9%, like I said, is very hard to get and very limited and so competitive that people don't put in an application unless they score all the points.
Wow.
And then the way the state decides is through a tiebreaker. And the tiebreaker is a 3-tier system. It starts with the points, then it drops to, are you in a high or highest zone? And then it drops to the best credit ratio per bedroom. So it's a very interesting set. And there's very little that you can do to gauge your competitors because you don't get to see their applications until the awards are completed. But the advantage then is if you're reapplying, you can find your other people that you think should reapply and look at what they did before. Now they can look at yours also. It's one of the things about California that's actually very beneficial, and that is I can find anybody's mortgage, what they paid for their property, the percent, owners, the whole 9 yards. So what it does is it makes the playing field very fair. In Texas, and I always use Texas as an example, they don't do any public reporting. So when you work with a broker, you have to know a broker that knows the different deals, unless you're a developer like I was, where you were always talking to everybody. And the bottom line was you knew more than most of the brokers knew. And that was who bought what they paid for it, what they're reselling it for, that sort of thing. Whereas in California, if I'm competing with somebody for a house sale, I know what they paid for it. I know when they paid for it. I know the status of their loan, and they would know mine. But the point is that it makes the average individual in the market, puts them on a pretty fair trading ground.
Yeah, and I love how you pointed out the transparency there, Al, because that's what it comes down to. Even if you're new to the field, you can see what type of projects have won the very competitive 9% tax credits. And if you obviously don't get the 9% tax credits, you will probably reapply for the 4% tax credits.
Well, now they've done something we had asked them to do many years ago and allow you to apply for both simultaneously.
Oh, they do that in California? Okay, I didn't know that. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you've got to be really up on your stuff to get that done. I mean, that's some high-tech documentation work. You got to know your programs really well.
I mean, there's a lot of work to just set that all up. And Al, I just want to keep things simple. Do you have a simple way of explaining what low-income housing tax credit is to, let's say, an 8-year-old?
Yeah,
tell us what that is. I'm looking for the best ways.
Well, I say 8-year-old. If the 8-year-old understands buying a home, because a home is the best example. Most all of us either have one that we've bought or want to buy one. And it comes down to the basics: the price of the home, the value of the home, the mortgage, and the equity. So what the tax credit program does is creates a way to generate equity beyond a simple 10 or 20% down. Because at a 10 or 20% down, you know what your interest rate is, so you know what your payment's going to be. Well, when you have apartments to rent, you know what your rent's going to be because you know market rate rents. You know what you need to price things at in order to provide the building that can be supported by those rents, less the expenses, of course. What the tax credit program does is says, okay, we'll create a program by which people who contribute to the program, buy the tax credits, get a tax write-off that's direct, dollar for dollar. It's a great deal for them because they not only get what they put in on a dollar for dollar over 10 years, but they also get the depreciation of the project, 99% of it. So that's a big win for those companies that invest. And they're all major because individuals can only put 10,000 in, and that's a waste of their time. It's a waste of the syndicator's time. They can't raise enough money that way. When you know what your restricted rents are going to be, that tells you how much mortgage you can afford, less expenses. And then the rest you need is equity. The equity is provided through the tax credit program if you win an award. And to win an award means you have to master this program so that when you put a deal together, it fits all their parameters. And you have the best people in the world who know numbers have created this. Now, it gets changed over the years and the changes don't always produce the results people think they will produce. And an example of that is when the state decided that you need to use subsidy so that you create more tax credits available and do more projects. Well, it didn't work out that way, because when you put more money in, there's only one place you can put it, and that's in construction. The land cost does not go to depreciable basis. Depreciable basis is what determines the tax credits. So all the money that is put in with subsidy has to go to the construction. So instead of building a $90,000 apartment, you're building a $650,000 apartment. Now, of course, there's a lot of soft costs thrown in there that I'm ignoring right now. But the point is you start building Taj Mahals instead of building standard apartments. So you'll find that most affordable apartments these days are top of the line buildings, some of the best. And they rent for some very low rents, which is great. However, the program didn't produce additional tax credits. Now, I don't know my data on that. I haven't taken the state to task and sat down and looked at it. I just know from being in the program that the money ends up, you can spend more for the land because you're putting more now into construction. So you're getting more tax credits. And even though it doesn't pay for the land, it pays for the total project. And because it takes 1.5 to 2.5 years from the time I locate a property till I get an award and can even start construction, you've got to pay more for the land to hold the land if you don't buy it outright. And you never buy it outright because you don't know if they're going to change the rules and your location is no longer valid. So you've got to tie things up and make it all contingent upon getting those tax credits. And to do that, you've got to offer a future value for the property instead of paying a present value. People that are going to wait with you 18 months to 2 years, they want to recoup that value. And you can't blame them because that's legitimate, in my opinion.
And I think this is so important to highlight for the audience. It's what I was talking about is essentially an option contract, right? You lock in an option and you might say, hey, in exchange for this option, I will pay you X amount of dollars or X amount of percentage more than what you might be listing the property for.
Yep,
but
that's exactly right.
You're paying more, but in exchange, you're getting more time because you do not want to be stuck holding the bag if you don't get these LIHTC credits, right? If you don't get these LIHTC credits, then you don't have a project. And now all of a sudden, especially if you bought the land and you're servicing debt on that land, you're in big, big trouble right there.
Well, that's exactly right. And when you do market rate, it's the same thing. Like we have the 405 units that we're on hold right now, pending the elections to see how things go, and to look at the market more carefully. And as I mentioned yesterday, if the Prop 33 goes through, we definitely will not build the apartments because rent control will be applied in the future. So that means my resale of that value of that project, if I don't resell it right away, it won't be worth much. It'll be declining value. And that's not why you build apartments. You build them for appreciation, not inflation per se, but appreciation. And you have inflation. So you have to deal with that.
And I just want to emphasize, this is not just for apartment builders. I mean, any normal person in the United States that buys a home, that might be one of your single most important wealth builders that you have for your family. You don't buy it expecting it's going to go down. You buy it so it goes up. So I don't want people thinking that this is like some money grabbing scheme in apartment building. No, it's common sense. Really,
it is. It's a legitimate business.
Exactly.
Now, there's a lot of outside the bounds stuff that goes on, but we just don't do that because we try and stay in for the long term. And the folks that I know that cut corners usually get caught. And I don't mean caught like they violated the law. I mean, they maybe have skinnied down on cost too much or something like that, and it comes back to haunt you. One thing great about the tax credit program is you're audited every year. That project is audited every year. And you have a reserve that you have to use to maintain your apartments. You have to keep that reserve current, and you have to maintain the apartments. So you'll find that affordable housing under the tax credit program produces a better product longer than anything else, longer than your market rate. Because in your market rate, as soon as your market starts to drop a little, that's the first thing that's cut back on is your maintenance. That doesn't mean you turn it to crap right away. It just means that over time, these things take a toll on the building. Whereas with the tax credit program, it's constantly maintained. So you end up in 55 years with a building that's as good as long as it's still functional for the people that are using it, because, things change over time. How you use your apartment changes. Like right now, people are looking for an office in their units because a lot of them are doing their own businesses, or they're bringing their work home and doing it remote. And I think that's fabulous, because then it cuts down on childcare issues and so many other things. So it's great that the businesses do that. And we have COVID to thank for that, along with technical gains that we've made. But I've gotten far away from your initial question, and that was the equity is brought in large enough so that the amount you borrow, under the percentage you borrow it, less the expenses, can be paid on a regular basis and maintain the validity of the project. So obviously, otherwise you don't want to give things up. Mm-hmm. And in the tax credit program, it's very painful if you have to put the project back, because you now have major companies that have relied on what you've said and have gotten their tax reduction. If you mess that up, they get recapture. They're coming to you. So you better do it right, watch your P's and Q's. That's why I like this program. I wish I was better at it, that I could put more projects together. But it's really, really a good program.
Yeah. And I see all the checks and balances that you were talking about, Al, right? It's like, hey, you cannot screw over your equity investors because of all these checks and balances. You have to have the reserves in place to take care of the property, because the equity investors also want their money back at the end of the compliance period, or 10
Well, the way the equity does is you buy them out for any tax implication. So you don't pay them back their equity. Their equity stays in the deal. Oh. But they get the tax payment back. See, they've written that off over 10 years, and they've had the depreciation over 15. So they are made whole by continuing to make money. That's why this program encourages profit. It encourages companies to hire and to do well. If they're going to invest in a tax credit program, they only do it because they are making money and they want to shelter it. And that's how this program is very advantageous. But like I said, yesterday it took away from, in 1986, it changed the tax law so that high income earners couldn't just invest in real estate and write it off.
And now, I guess to help the audience understand the difference, right? Do you have a general rule of thumb for how much equity a 9% tax credit deal will create versus a 4% tax credit? So just so I want people to understand.
60%.
60% for 9% tax credits.
Yes, about 60%. And the 4% creates about a 4% equity, because your rents are higher in a tax credit, a tax exempt bond program. You'll have more 60 and 80% AMI rents with a small 10% of 30%.
For a 4% deal, that's what you're talking about.
For a 4% deal. You'll have 60s down to 30s, and you'll have the full spread.
And the reason why 9% is more advantageous because it creates more equity, but then in order to score the points to earn those 9% tax credits, that's why you're saying the rents are typically set aside for people making 30% of the area median income and 60%. So it's a different type of demographic, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And 4% tax credits, does that generally equate to like 20 to 30% of the equity stack?
It could be as much as 40.
It can be much as 40. Okay, got it. Well, maybe this is a good time to talk about the bonds that you were talking about, right? Because I don't think a lot of people understand. Sometimes I just like to tell people that bonds is it's just debt. That's all it is. But
it is. That's all
you have to issue the debt through either a 501c3 nonprofit or a government entity that's issuing those bonds. But how do you see tax exempt bonds? Have you ever seen a project done completely with tax exempt bonds before?
Oh yeah, many. And lately, that's the majority of.
And what's the advantage of going through tax exempt bonds instead of saying, like, why do people pursue a 9% tax credit versus the 4 tax exempt bonds?
Well, the 9% was prevalent for a long time because it brought in all the equity you needed, and you really didn't have to go after the subsidies as much. Now it's to the point where the program is so oversubscribed that unless you're the top of the top of the top, you're not going to get it. And that's a lot of money you invest to get to that point, to get turned down. could have anywhere from 50 to 250,000 in a project easily. The 9% really, you cap at a certain amount because the sweet spot in the 9% program is 80 units. It's going to require just enough subsidy and just enough tax credits that will fit into the allocation for the county. So if you go too big, you can't get that many tax credits because the county that you're putting it into doesn't have those available. And the way they get tax credits is based on their population. So you get, I think it's $4.75 per person in tax credits. It used to be like $1.25 or something like that. It's come up over the years with inflation. So your sweet spot is around 80 units. And if you watch and pay attention to what the market is in the tax credit arena, you'll see from the previous time where they had to cut off the applications. In other words, they get to a point where they're fully subscribed. Now, sometimes they have a small amount left. And if they do, they can double that and borrow from the next year's. But it's not a lot. So in those cases, when you see a county or a set-aside that hasn't met its full quota, or that you see the applications are limited going in, you do a smaller project if you have it. Now, the problem is you can't just go, oh, I see that, I'll go do a smaller project. Doesn't work that way. You have to have this in process for a year. So if you get lucky and have a small project, you can clean up the scraps. And we've done that in the past too. But it's luck. You can't plan these things by the way the program works. You don't know who's going to come in and who isn't, because you won't know until the applications actually hit. Now, you'll have a good idea who put one in last year or last round and it's going to come back, but you have no idea who else is coming in because it's not advertised.
Yeah.
I certainly don't advertise.
And that's the risk that you go through. It's almost like a nice little decision tree that you just talked about, hours, where like, hey, look at your project, look at your scores. If it's over 80 units, chances are you're going to exceed the cap. It might not even be worth it. Just go for the 4%.
Depends on the county.
That's
true. Depends
on
how much subsidy is available. So that's the sweet spot. Then in the bonds, you want to start around 120 to 150 units and go up. Because in the bonds, the larger the project, the better the numbers work overall. The cost of the bond itself is pretty much the same if you're doing 80 units or if you're doing 160 units.
And the reason you're saying that is because there's a lot of upfront costs, right? Legal fees,
the upfront costs
insurance
are
costs.
Huge.
So the more units that you have, the more revenue you can generate, and you have a better ability to service the debt for those bonds. And
you distribute the cost over more units. So each unit is bearing a small amount instead of the lion's share. It's severe brain damage.
Well, that's why we got to have a podcast about it, because someone out there is feeling that brain damage right now. And they're thinking, hey, I heard about this tax exempt bond thing. And obviously the interest you earn on these tax exempt bonds, if they are meant for the public good, right? In this scenario, it's for affordable housing. Well, all the interest they earn on that is exempt from federal income taxes. Now, where does the whole ecosystem of these bonds come from, Al? Like, does the government have, like a local city or county have the authority to issue those bonds? And where do they get this money from?
Yes, they issue the bonds and then they have to sell the bonds. And they have it all set up. But if you come in, well, for example, the Irvine Company came in about 10, 12 years ago and applied for over $1 billion for bonds. And it was just too big for the state. The state went, no, we don't want to do one project. So the Irvine Company very intelligently went, okay, we're going to look at this differently, and did an about face and went a different way. But sometimes it can be too big. Most of the companies I work with and have put deals together for, they know what works. So we usually gear what we look for to suit what that tax credit market's going to support. So LA, for example, can handle big projects, but you have to be in their system for years before you can get your project teed up. Now, if they have a slot for a smaller project and you happen to fit in, great, but they control it. The Tax Credit Allocation Committee only blesses what they put in. They don't decide which project in LA gets which deal. LA decides which project gets the deal. And they're all professional. They know the numbers. They know what they can do. They know if this is a good project, bad project. There's no politics involved that I know of. There's no relationships involved. Now, if you're big in the project, in the program, and you understand it really well, you're talking to the top people, but at the same time, they're not giving you preference. I mean, now they love companies that have great reputations and do a good job. They love those companies. But the system's not set up to favor them over another application. It's set up on a point system with a tiebreaker that's black and white. You either meet it or you don't. And the one who does the best job wins. So I applaud their system. And I've seen other systems that in Florida, it used to be that if one developer got the tax credits and another one in his area didn't, he could sue that guy. And then they'd have a big fight over it. And then they'd have to go to court, and then they'd have to prove every piece that they did. We don't have any of that because the system's been set up here right. They've done a great job. Florida doesn't have that anymore either. And some states have had corruption. That's been washed out. It's been cleaned up. California has never, that I know of, in the 30 years I've done the program, I've never heard of a black eye ever. It's black and white, cut and dried. Everybody's fair game, fair opportunity. So you can be a small developer or consortium of guys if you do it right and hire the right consultants. I mean, Novogradac is one of the best accounting firms in the country. There's a handful more that know the tax credit program exceedingly well. There's a few attorneys that know the overviews really, really well and can be of great help. So there are some really great professionals. They're expensive, but they're expensive for a reason. They know what they're doing.
Well, I love how you just went through that explanation. And again, I love the transparency in the system because I didn't know there's that much disparity across different states. But it makes sense that everybody runs their own allocation plan a little differently. Right. So when you had the 4% tax credits, right? Al, do you see typically people going after like these tax exempt bonds, or do they go after a traditional construction loan? How do they fill that gap?
That's the nice part about the bonds is the bonds are run through a bank, naturally, a financial institution. And that institution, if you have an allocation and they are selling or taking those bond funds in, well, they will lend you your construction and they're happy to do it because you've got all this equity coming in. And you usually take it at 15% up front and then 85% at the back end. And that gives you the best per dollar return on your equity. So, you had mentioned earlier, well, you could sell your tax credit dollar for 85 cents. Well, when times are really, really strong, you can sell it for $1.10. And I've seen that, but that's unusual. Right now, it's in the 95-cent range, but that's where the market is. And it depends on the economy. When COVID hit, it cratered so many big companies that the tax credit program was not an issue for them. They had enough write-off. So when times are really good, the tax credit program really produces. It really does. Right. Now, it's maxed out every year, but the question is how much do you get per dollar and how many of the tax credits have to be used in order to fund each project? So if you're only getting 85 cents on the dollar, you have to have more tax credits to fund your project. So,
and Al, when you talked earlier about the best way for you to maximize the benefit was to take 15% up front and 85% in the back end. What does that mean exactly?
What that means is it's like if you're buying a home on time and you decide, well, I'm only going to put down 5% now, but the requirement is 20%. Well, all right, I'll put 5 down now. And then when I'm ready to close, when I have my loan, because I'm building this home, when I have my loan, my construction done, I'll put the other 85% in, or, in this case, if you're doing 20% down, you'd put your other 15% in. At the end, when you close, now you've already built your place, so the value's there. And that's what, it takes all the construction risk away from the equity provider. And they'll give you a better dollar for that lack of risk. But if you want it all up front, it's hard to get. And they're not going to pay you as much because then they are assuming the construction risk. Now, the bank assumes a great deal of the construction risk, but under the tax credit program, they know how it can turn out, and it's very beneficial for them. and it's pretty safe. It's a lot safer than a market rate.
And when we talk about the 15% upfront, 85% the back end, I just to make clear, we're referring to the equity investors.
Correct.
Not the debt. Because if you have a bond or the form of debt to construct.
The debt is right up front. So with the bond, the bank will fund all of your construction, and then the bond will repay the bulk of that, and the equity will repay the rest. So that the developer himself has, in essence, pre-sold the building in the development fees that they get for having produced it. So it's like you're selling on a future value. So your return is reduced for that future value. Just as if I was selling you a house on time, but you want it all now, you want all your money now, and you're saying the future value of this project is this, and I go, okay, well, we'll discount it for time, and I'll pay you that. I might be getting a little too confusing here.
No, I think you're on the right page because I mean, I follow it, and I think people just want to make sure, I just want to make sure people understand, like, why would you want equity in the first place? It's because, well, you don't have to pay interest on it, right? So that's where you kind of balance your cost of capital throughout your lifetime, right? If you draw all debt at the beginning, well, guess what? You have to pay interest on the amount you borrow. But if you have a little bit of equity up front to get the project rolling, and then you draw on the debt immediately following afterwards, and then you supplement with the equity on the back end, then you get more money in exchange for your tax credits. But there's all these different covenants and all these different restrictions, right? So for example, sometimes for these, I mean, for a 4% deal, you have to make sure that you draw the full 50% of the capital stack in order to qualify. And if you don't, there are legal ramifications for not meeting that.
They've changed the 50% test.
Oh, did they?
What
is it now?
It's lower now.
Okay.
It's lower now because of the market and what was needed. And these are smart people. These are smart people. I made friends with a guy, and we're still good friends today. And I met him probably 15 odd years ago. He was the guy who wrote the programs for the bills that came out. He would take a bill a stated bill on what it's supposed to do, and he'd write the program to make sure that happened fairly and legally. Because sometimes these bills are a little bit one way or the other. He would write these. And to me, that is difficult, because when the allocation committee says to people year after year, give us your input. How would you do this? What would you do differently? I'm not that smart. I can't. Now I can tell them where we've had problems or where we've had issues or where we might see something. But in terms of writing these programs, wow, that takes somebody who understands it top to bottom, inside and out.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it takes the right language, the right provisions to kind of put that all together.
The tenacity to write it and rewrite it and rewrite it until it actually works.
Yeah. And I think it just goes back to, we talk so much about managing risk today. And one of the issues that we see with tax exempt bonds for new construction projects is if you do an entire project with tax exempt bonds, not LIHTC, it's that you have to issue the entire debt package, all the bonds at once. So if for a new construction project, if you're not going to see rent payments for a year and a half, 2 years, maybe 2.5 years if you get unlucky, I mean, you're carrying that interest carry on the entire capital stack.
So that's what
makes it sometimes financially untenable as a project, because then now
you have to do an arbitrage. You have to hedge it. You have to invest it in something that will generate enough to bring your interest costs down. And you have to also put reserves so that you have that. It's very complicated. It is.
So if you take that strategy, now all of a sudden you have something else to manage, which is like, what's your investment strategy for the arbitrage, like Al said, to make up for that difference. So everything has a pros and cons. Al, maybe we talked about LIHTC, we talked about tax exempt bonds. How about HUD loans, traditional HUD insured loans for new construction? Have you done any project using HUD?
Yeah, they take 2 years.
That's the downfall.
You've got to have a real long-term ownership of the land and strategy. They are every bit as stringent. They have the requirements and regulations. They take every project seriously, but the bureaucracy takes forever to get through. And it's very beneficial because you have assumable mortgages. And in the bonds, you have that, but it's a different process and a different reason. But under HUD, it's pretty much market rate with some discounts. But otherwise, when you sell that project, you have an assumable mortgage. So if you're in at a great rate, you have value, especially when rates go up. Your apartment project now has gained more value because you have this lower interest rate. So there's value there, there's benefits there. But again, brain damage, a lot of it, and a long tolerance for getting things done. The program puts all the upfront risk on the developer. You put out all the money to get your phase one, prove that your land's okay. Soils report, make sure you can actually build what you want to build there and know that your foundation costs are going to be covered. So that upfront risk is handled by the time you get your entitlements and you're ready to do your production drawings. At that point is when you know if you won an award or not. And if not, you've spent a lot of money that's not going anywhere. You want to try and do it again if the landowner is tolerant, or if you've written that into your agreement that you get 2 or 3 bites at the apple. And it costs you to do that. You've got to pay to do that, whether it's money up front or whether it's in the increased value in the land. And then you resubmit again. Hopefully you'll win it this next time. Then once you've won it, if you're only getting your equity 15% up front, you're taking the construction risk to make sure that the equity provider, when he puts his 85% in, that the building works, the rents work. Now, one of the reasons that people love the tax credit program is our rents are always a minimum of 10% below market rate, unless a market tanks. Then there's nothing anybody can do. You're going to have to meet market. But as far as California is concerned, the reason people love tax credit deals in California is because the expenses and the rents always go up, always. Now, they may not go real fast like we've just experienced, but they go according to the county income, the area median income. If it increases, the rents increase. If it decreases, the rents stay the same. And that gives your equity investor a guarantee that they're not going to lose on the deal and have to take a recapture, because recapture is ungodly expensive.
Oh, yeah. And I love how we just kind of went through all different ways of financing new construction. I mean, obviously, the downsides of a HUD loan, and we've heard best case scenario 6 months, but it could easily take 1 year, 2 years just due to auto approvals, because you have someone that is insuring the loan, which is why the whole benefit of a HUD loan is like you might get to 35, 40 years amortization. You might get 85, 87% loan to cost on your project, but it takes a long time, but you have to make up for it with some brain damage. So you got to pick and choose. But the whole point of today's podcast was for all of you guys to understand that are listening right now, there are multiple options. And when you can evaluate these deals and multiple options, it forces you to consider what is the best path forward, how much time and energy you want to put into each one, because they all have their ups and downs, right? And this is what's most important that I really want the audience to take away today. And Paul, I know we're almost at time. Do you have a few more minutes to talk about the SB bills in California? Do you want to go through your perspective on those ones?
We can touch on them. We really can't go through them. They're pretty elaborate, but they're all done with good intentions. Their intentions are good, but there are politics involved in those. The politics involved there is with their biggest voting bloc is the unions. And so the unions want to see prevailing wage in most of those bills. Now, the SB4, which is for education, nonprofits, and religious, yes, in God's backyard, that does not have prevailing wage attached to it. Because it's brand new, not everybody knows how to deal with it either, particularly in the cities. So you've got planners who are your front line. Those are the guys that get yelled at if they do it wrong, but at the same time, they need guidance to do it right. So it's a rock and a hard place for them. So their supervisors have issues that they have to deal with. And then they have the politics that are involved with developers who are going straight to the mayor, or they're going straight to the city council, or they're going to go straight to their state representative, or they're going to go right to HCD, which is the Housing and Community Development Group. And I know because that's what we're doing right now. We're complaining to them about what we have to get done, and we're not getting the cooperation we need. So that happens. And we try and do it as politely as possible so that everybody knows it's open book. We don't go behind the planner's back, but they know, because we tell them up front, we need to help get you guidance. And the way to get you guidance is to go to the next level and the level over that till we find the person who can say, authorize this.
And I think that's the thing with legislation, right? When it's new, you don't necessarily expect like a PDF from the state or the federal government to trickle down correctly to all the folks on the front line.
Well, so I think it doesn't. And it doesn't come with instruction.
Mm-hmm. That's the problem.
It comes with a set of what you're allowed to do. Now, how you get there, everybody wants to interpret their own way. And the way we read a bill and the way the attorneys read the bill and advise us is the way that we then attack. And if we can't get it done through the city, we go to the state. And the HCD is the front line. They're the guys that say, we're the enforcement agents. They don't like to be. That's not their preferred role. They want to create housing. That's all they want to do. And that's their God-given mission, and they love it. And when you see the amount of stuff they actually turn out that is great, you just applaud them. I mean, it's wonderful. It's wonderful the things that get done and the people that get the benefit from it. But it's difficult. It's hard to get there.
And I'm so glad you're applauding them. You're recognizing their efforts out.
They don't get a lot of applause. They don't get a lot of thank yous and good boys and way to go. And the ones that they get, they appreciate. Now, not so much from us because we're on the front lines also. And we're up there trying to do our best. So I always treat them in terms of how I would love to have them treat me. And it's like, I respect you. I know what your job is, but I also know how limited you can be. You have rules and regulations you got to live with. And you're going to get yelled at or you're going to get a pat on the back one way or the other, or just get to keep your job. Who knows? But the truth of it is they're no different than I am. They're out there making a living and doing their best job they can do. So for me, I just thank them. I just appreciate them. And the higher it goes, the more I appreciate them because those are the guys that have to answer to it eventually. So they work hard. They truly work hard. They're not the way we usually hold government employees that, well, they're just putting in their time. No, these folks are passionate, especially around affordable housing. They take it as their mission.
And now that's probably the best way to end today's podcast recording is it's just for everybody to understand. You put yourself in other people's shoes and act collaboratively, be a team, look out for each other's interests. Everybody is on the same goal, creating housing. Everybody's way of approaching that method might be a little different, but we can all work together. We can all collaborate. I believe in collaboration over competition. So, Al, I'm so grateful for you spending another hour plus of your time today, talking to us on it, sharing your wisdom on all the different ways of financing and the pros and the cons, because not that many people take the time to explain concepts like that to the people, to just normal human beings that want to do good with their time and energy, but they don't even know where to start. And you took the time today to explain it. And I'm just so grateful for you coming onto the podcast again, Al. I'm so appreciative of it. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Ken. I mean, I think you and I speak the same voice because it's not about me. You know, it's about what we can produce. It's about who we can help. The thing that I want to leave as in my way of looking at it, if I do a 100-unit project, I don't help 100 families. I help thousands of families because the average turnover is 3.5 years. So that means a family has been in perhaps for 3.5 years and they've done better and things have improved and they've gotten to maybe buy a home now or something else, or they've moved or who knows. But the turnover is about every 3.5 years. So if you take 100 units, and every 3.5 years, you're turning them over. Look how many families are being helped when the rents are anywhere from 30% of area median income to 60% of area median income. That's a gigantic help.
Al, if you have spare a few more minutes, do you have a story of a resident that moved into one of your developments or your units that you can remember that you can tell a story of? I really just want people to feel inspired.
Well, quite a few, actually, because I've been very fortunate. Now, I haven't done a grand opening in 20 years, but when I first got in the business, we would do that. We'd celebrate all our wins and go to the grand openings or hold the grand openings for people who had moved in. And when I do senior housing, it was the best because seniors would literally be crying coming to me saying thank you.
Do you remember the stories at all? Like, was there a resident, a woman or a man that moved into one of the units that you might have talked to? I'd love to kind of just hear their story. And
well, there were several that were on the list for over 3 years trying to get affordable housing. And when they finally got it, they could move out of, well, one gal moved out of her sister's bedroom because that's the only way she could survive, was living with her sister. And when you're in your 70s and living with your sister, you don't feel very accomplished. And that's the thing. And for families, yes, we've had families of 3 and 4 children, and the parents are exhausted because they're both working 2 jobs. They've got child care, they've got their hands full. And when you can reduce their rents and put them in a 3-bedroom or a 4-bedroom apartment, a third of what it would cost, they're grateful. And yeah, I mean, but there's so many people I've talked to that it'd be hard to single them out.
well, again, that's why I'm just so grateful for you coming on and sharing those stories, because I think it's sometimes when we're knee deep in a pro forma and Excel workbook, we forget about the people that we're trying to help. And my family was one of those families. Thanks to people like you, we had a great home to grow up in, and I got to go off to college and become a better version of myself. And now I get to have a podcast conversation like with you to create more affordable housing.
Well, plus you're doing some bonds and stuff like that. That all helps.
It's a full circle, Al, and
it helps the cause.
I'm so grateful for what you do now, and hopefully I can bring you back onto the podcast again at some point. I can't wait to bring you back on to keep talking about all the deals that you're working on and how you're valuing all these exit strategies, because we just want to get into your head and really understand how you look at these projects. I think there's just so much more to learn.
Well, I've got one that I'm working with an SB4 right now, and we're going to learn a lot. So I'm looking forward to that. And then, of course, the market rates are the market rates. So we'll see how those go. But in general, that's it. It's time for me to start putting more projects together.
All right. Well, let's do it together, man. All right, Al.
Thanks,
this is fun. And we are out.